I'm working in Adobe Illustrator CC 2018. If you're using an earlier version, things may be slightly different, but for the most part, things will be very much the same when I talk about keyboard commands and things like that. So we're practicing with the pen tool here. I have selected the pen tool over in my tools palette. You can hit S on your keyboard to bring that up. I've selected that pen tool, and then down below I've made sure that I have clicked on the stroke to bring it to the front, and I double clicked to set my color in this instance to a magenta color. I do that because I want it to be different than just using a black line. That way I can clearly see what I'm working on, because it's so different from everything around it. So it really calls attention to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Command and my space bar, and that will allow me to click and zoom into an area that I want to work on. In this case, I'm going to be working on this speech bubble, and I'm going to be tracing around the outside of it, and I will walk you through everything that I'm doing. So I like to start on a straight edge or on a corner, a clear corner point. Rarely will I ever start on a curve unless the whole illustration is made up of curves. It's just easier to start from either a corner or on a straight line. So I'm going to start down here, and I'm going to click. I'm just going to click one time, and that will set my first point. This guideline that you see, that is available in Adobe Illustrator CC 2018. It may be on some earlier versions, but the very early versions will not have that, so you won't see this guide. It's a very helpful guide to let you know where the line will exist as you're working. So if you don't have that, don't worry about it. We can still continue on. I've clicked my first point. I'm going to click my second point here. It's just a straight line, so I'm not holding down any keys. And it's going up here at an angle. Now, I will hold down my Shift key. And what my Shift key does is, see how I can move my mouse around here? I can pivot it freely, 360 degrees. If I hold down my Shift key, it will be in 45-degree increments. So I can do a perfect horizontal line. And I'm going to click, holding down my Shift key, I'm going to drag out, and I'm actually going to click here. Now again, you may not see that helpful guideline. So if you're just holding down your Shift key and you click a point, it will create a straight line. The next line the next point I'm going to set is right about here after the curve. So I'm going to click, and as I am holding down the mouse button, I'm going to hold down my Shift key. So I got my mouse button and my Shift key held down. I'm going to drag up, and it's going to create a curve here as I drag up. These things that come off this point as I'm dragging away from the point, these are called handles, and they're equal length on both sides of that point. In this case, I'm just going to let go, and I'm going to hold down my Shift key again to create a nice rigid vertical line. I'm going to click. There's a point there. And I'm going to click after the curve. I'm going to hold down my mouse button and my Shift key together. Drag out. Got my handles that are equal on both sides of that point again in length. I'm going to let go. Hold down my Shift key for this horizontal line, making sure that it is perfectly horizontal, that it's not off at some angle like this or that. Holding down that Shift key will constrain it. I'll click and make another point. Same thing down here. I'll click, hold down my mouse button still, and hold down my Shift key and drag in the direction that I'm going. So I'm coming down now. Let go. Hold down my Shift key. It's the same thing all the way around because I'm dealing with straight lines and in curves. So this next one, I'm holding down my Shift key, and I'm going to click right before the curve, and I'm going to click after the curve, hold down my Shift key and drag my mouse out. Got equal handles on both sides again. Let go, Hold down my Shift key again to straighten that out. You see how it's snapping back? All right. Again, if you don't have these guidelines, you'll be okay. If you just hold down that Shift key, you'll draw a nice horizontal line. I'm going to click on that corner. And now I'm going to close it up. And again, you can see, I've mentioned this in earlier exercises, you can see that when you go to close a shape, or close the path, close this line up to make a shape, you'll see that icon, or your cursor, it will change. It'll change and it'll have a little O, little open O there. Okay, that's just letting you know that you're closing up the shape and you're completing the path all the way around. Gonna click, and now I have a shape. All right, so let me explain one thing here. It's gonna be a very helpful tip for you. As I'm using the pen tool, I have some shortcut options that I can use. For the most part, when I'm working on stuff with the pen tool, and when I'm creating shapes, I will use three tools. I'll use the pen tool itself, standard pen tool. I will use underneath the pen tool what's called the anchor point tool. It's also called the convert anchor point tool in earlier versions of Adobe Illustrator. And I will also, lastly, use up here the direct selection tool. So earlier versions will have it as a black arrow and a white arrow tool, or an open arrow. So those are the three things that I use. I use that direct selection, the pen, and then underneath the pen, the anchor point. Three basic tools. You see there are other things here. There's the add anchor point tool and the delete anchor point tool. Don't really have to worry about those. I'll show you why in a later video. While we're working on stuff, I'll show you. So we got that pen tool. So I want to show you really quickly before we move on to the next video. I want to show you what you can do. I have the pen tool held or selected, and if I hold down my Option key on the keyboard, it will temporarily give me access to this tool, the anchor point tool, or the convert anchor point tool. So again, with the pen tool selected, holding down Option gives me temporary access. And I'll show you in the next video what that temporary access does, how we can use it while we're working. The other thing I can do is if I hold down Command, it will give me temporary access to the direct selection tool. So Option gives me access to the convert anchor point tool. Also the anchor point tool, that's what it's known as, same thing. And Command, one more time, gives me access to the direct selection tool. So with Command held down, in this case, I'm going to click off my illustration and I'm going to show you that nothing is selected. We have a nice shape that we've drawn with paths around this speech bubble. We've traced around the outside. I'll show you more in the next video in this series.